It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away from the chaos of the city. After weeks of stress and late nights at work, a secluded cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect retreat. The cabin was a small, rustic place nestled deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. There was no cell service, no internet, and no distractions. Just the quiet of nature and the chance to finally unwind. The drive up was long and winding, but the beauty of the forest made it worthwhile. The leaves were just beginning to change, painting the landscape in shades of orange, red, and gold. When the cabin came into view, it looked like something out of a postcard. Charming, with its wooden beams and stone chimney, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. The first day was everything that had been hoped for. The weather was perfect, the air crisp and clean. A book was read on the porch, a hike through the woods, and a fire was built in the stone hearth as the sun began to set. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the perfect escape. But as the night grew darker, the isolation that had seemed so appealing began to feel more ominous. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to rustle and creak. It was then that the strange noises began. At first, it was just the occasional thump, which could easily be dismissed as the settling of the old cabin or the wind knocking a branch against the roof. But then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves just outside the cabin door. The first thought was that it might be a deer or some other animal, curious about the cabin. But as the footsteps grew closer, a sinking feeling set in. They were too heavy, too deliberate to be an animal. It sounded like a person. Peering out the window, nothing could be seen but darkness. The forest was a black void, with only the faint outline of trees visible under the pale light of the moon. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. But the uneasy feeling remained, a sense that someone, or something, was out there, watching. Trying to shake off the unease, the door was double-checked to ensure it was locked, and a decision was made to call it a night. But sleep did not come easily. Every creak and groan of the cabin sounded like it was amplified in the silence of the night. Sometime after midnight, there was a loud bang on the door, as if someone had thrown their full weight against it. Heart pounding, the covers were thrown off, and a cautious approach to the door was made. The pounding continued, each strike more forceful than the last. The first thought was to shout, to scare off whoever or whatever was outside. But fear kept any sound from escaping. Instead, there was only silence as the banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. The door was checked again, making sure it was secure. Just as there was a return to bed, the windows rattled as if someone was trying to force them open. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger now. It was clear that staying here until morning was the only option. Going outside in the dark would be far too dangerous. The rest of the night was spent in a state of tense vigilance. The noises outside continued sporadically. Footsteps circling the cabin, the sound of something brushing against the walls, and the occasional rattle of the windows. But no matter how hard one listened, there was never any clear indication of what was out there. Eventually, the noises stopped altogether, replaced by the eerie quiet of the pre-dawn hours. The first light of day was a welcome sight, casting away the shadows that had seemed so threatening just hours before. When it felt safe enough to step outside, the area around the cabin was checked. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. It was as if the night had been a bad dream, and yet the fear had been real. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, a place where the line between reality and imagination had blurred too easily. Packing up quickly, it was time to leave the cabin behind. The drive back through the forest was a relief, the sight of civilization bringing a sense of safety. The weekend escape had been anything but relaxing, but there was comfort in knowing that whatever had happened in those woods had been left behind. Returning to normal life, the memory of the cabin lingered. It was hard to shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that couldn't be explained. Friends and family were told about the experience, but most just laughed it off, saying it was probably an animal or just the imagination running wild in the dark. But the experience left a lasting impression, a reminder that even in places of peace and solitude, there can be an undercurrent of fear. The cabin in the woods had been meant as a retreat, but it had become a place where something unknown had brushed against the edges of reality. Though life moved on, the thought of returning to the woods brought a sense of unease. The cabin was just a memory now, but one that would always be tinged with the chill of that dark night and the unanswered question of what had been out there, hidden in the shadows. The cabin was meant to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to escape the city and its relentless pace. Nestled in a dense forest, it was a charming wooden structure with a cozy interior, complete with a stone fireplace and large windows that offered a stunning view of the surrounding woods. It was perfect for a weekend of solitude and relaxation. But something about the cabin felt different from the moment of arrival. It wasn't just the isolation. It was as if the cabin had a history, a presence that went beyond the charm of its decor. One particular object stood out: a large, ornate mirror in the living room, framed in intricately carved wood. It was a striking piece, but its reflection seemed off, as if it distorted reality just slightly. The first evening was calm, with a warm fire crackling and the forest outside blanketed in snow. But as night fell, the mirror began to draw attention. It seemed to cast shadows that didn't match the light source and distorted reflections in unsettling ways. The feeling that something was not quite right grew stronger. The mirror seemed to come alive as the night progressed. Every time one glanced at it, the reflection appeared slightly different. The shadows in the room, which should have been cast by the fireplace and the lamp, seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. The movements in the mirror were subtle but disconcerting. As the hours passed, the reflections began to take on a more distinct form. Figures appeared in the mirror's surface, faint, ghostly shapes that seemed to move and interact with one another. They were not clear enough to identify, but their presence was undeniable. They seemed to mimic the actions of the person in front of the mirror, yet their movements were slightly out of sync. The reflection of the forest outside the window also seemed to distort, becoming a darker, more foreboding landscape. The mirror's surface appeared to ripple and twist, as if trying to draw the outside world into its own realm. By the second night, the mirror's influence had grown stronger. The reflections became more vivid, and the figures in the glass seemed to reach out, as if trying to escape their confinement. It was as if the mirror was a portal, showing a twisted version of reality that was not meant to be seen. The feeling of being watched grew more intense. Every time one turned away from the mirror, there was a sense that something was trying to emerge from it. The air in the cabin felt colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in response to the reflections in the glass. Sleep became elusive. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, and the reflections in the mirror seemed to taunt and mock. There was a sense that the cabin was becoming a trap, a place where the boundary between reality and the mirror's distorted world was blurring. Unable to ignore the mounting fear, the decision was made to cover the mirror. A large sheet was draped over it, hoping to block out its unsettling reflections. But the sense of dread did not dissipate. The mirror seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, even through the fabric covering it. That night, the noises in the cabin grew louder, scratching sounds coming from the walls, whispers that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. The unsettling feeling was overpowering, and it felt as if the mirror's curse had spread through the entire cabin. It was as though the presence in the mirror was reaching out, affecting everything around it. Desperate to escape, the decision was made to leave the cabin immediately. The drive back through the snowy forest was tense, with every shadow and rustle in the trees feeling menacing. The cabin, once a retreat, had become a source of deep, unshakable fear. Returning to the city brought relief, but the memory of the cabin and its cursed mirror lingered. The experience had been a haunting reminder of the thin line between reality and the unknown. The mirror's reflection had shown a distorted reality, a glimpse into something dark and unsettling that was best left unseen. The cabin was never revisited, and the mirror remained covered in the back of the mind. The weekend escape had turned into a chilling encounter with a malevolent force, leaving a lasting impression that served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of confronting the unknown. Though life resumed its normal pace, the thought of that mirror and its distorted reflections remained. A reminder that some places are better left undisturbed and some reflections are best left hidden. The decision to spend a weekend in the cabin was an impulsive one, made after weeks of feeling burnt out. The cabin belonged to a friend who had insisted it was the perfect place to unwind. Isolated in a dense forest, the cabin was quaint and charming, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out the rest of the world. It seemed like an ideal retreat until the first night. The evening started peacefully. After a long drive, a simple dinner was enjoyed, followed by reading in front of the fireplace. The silence of the forest was comforting, a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. But as the night grew darker, a strange sound began to echo through the cabin. At first, it was faint, like a distant hum, barely noticeable above the crackling of the fire. But as the hours passed, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing steadily from somewhere deep within the walls. It was unsettling, but there was a rational explanation. Perhaps it was just the old pipes or the wind playing tricks on the mind. The next day, the sound was forgotten as the sun brought warmth and light to the cabin. A hike through the woods and a day spent exploring the nearby stream filled the hours. By the time the sun set, the strange noise from the previous night had become a distant memory. But as darkness fell, the sound returned, louder and more persistent. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a low, mournful melody, like a distant flute playing a sorrowful tune. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, filling the cabin with its eerie presence. Searching the cabin for the source of the sound proved fruitless. There was no hidden speaker, no old radio left on by mistake. The sound seemed to resonate from the very walls, as if the cabin itself was singing its mournful song. The feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing note. The melody was haunting, tugging at something deep within, evoking a sense of loss and despair that was impossible to shake. Unable to sleep, a search for answers began. The cabin had been owned by the same family for generations, and the friend who had lent it out had mentioned its long history. But nothing had been said about any strange occurrences. A quick search through the old books and papers left in the cabin revealed little, until an old journal was found tucked away in a drawer. The entries were faded, but one passage stood out. It spoke of a tragic event, a family that had once lived in the cabin, long before it had been modernized. According to the journal, they had been musicians known for the beautiful music they played together. But one night, they had all vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their instruments. The journal claimed that ever since their disappearance, strange sounds had been heard in the cabin at night, music that no one could find the source of, echoing through the walls. The journal's revelation sent a chill down the spine. The sound was still echoing through the cabin, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if the music was trying to communicate, to tell the story of those who had vanished. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, there was a search for the old instruments mentioned in the journal. The cabin's small attic, accessed by a rickety ladder, seemed the most likely place to find them. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings. Pushed to the back of the attic under a pile of old blankets were 3 instruments: a violin, a flute, and a drum. They were old, they were worn and cracked with age, but they were unmistakably the source of the music. As soon as they were uncovered, the melody in the cabin changed, becoming more frantic, more desperate. It was clear that the instruments held some connection to the vanished family, that their spirits were tied to the music that still echoed through the cabin. Realizing the instruments were the key, there was only one thing left to do: destroy them. It was a desperate idea, but the only one that made sense. The cabin had become a place of sorrow, trapped in the past, and the music was its way of holding on to that tragedy. One by one, the instruments were taken outside and smashed. The violin splintered underfoot, the flute snapped in half, and the drum was torn apart. With each destruction, the music in the cabin grew louder, reaching a crescendo that shook the very walls. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the cabin felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its walls. The spirits of the family, it seemed, had been released from whatever had bound them to this place. The rest of the night passed without incident, and as the sun rose, the decision was made to leave the cabin behind for good. The weekend retreat had turned into a confrontation with the past, but it had ended with a sense of closure, both for the cabin and for the spirits that had haunted it. The drive back to the city was peaceful, the memory of the music fading with each passing mile. The cabin had been a place of sadness and loss, but it was now at peace. The haunting melody was gone, and with it, the echoes of the past.